Thank you for those of you who managed to keep your cameras on. I really appreciate. Those who couldn't or for privacy reasons is absolutely fine, but you know, we have a nice environment in which we can communicate. So my name is Correia. I am a graduate from the London School of Economics, and I research particularly the question of memories of violence. And I'm also a specialist on the Balkans and specifically in Bosnia. So my research over the last 10 years has been about the memory of war in Bosnia. So for this talk in specific, bearing in mind what I was asked, I will give you a quick overview of what led to the war in Bosnia and how the war evolved. This is a very quick overview, and I expect that we will have some questions. And of course, anyone who wants to know more is free to get in touch and ask for reading materials, whatever you need, or discussion. That's absolutely fine. So without further delay, so this year is 25 years since the end of the war in Bosnia. In 1995, November 1995, the war ended with a peace agreement called the Dayton Peace Agreement. And this agreement resulted in the de facto division of the country, but short of secession, short of a partition. So since the last 25 years, the country has lived with this very strange, very strange political system, very strange political architecture in which it's not a federation, but it's not a unified country either. And there's all sorts of problems that can come with that. But there is also the fact that the war did not resume. So we can say that, you know, Bosnia has lived in relative peace for the last 25 years. But so before this war happened, Bosnia, there was this, you know, this territory called Bosnia and Herzegovina has historically existed since at least the Middle Ages. You know, with its own specificities that have to do very much with its geography. It's a mountain country. You know, it's demarcated by a few rivers that make it some kind of natural border, but it has also this specificity since the Middle Ages of being an area that is also marks the limit of different empires. So this was the case throughout, you know, in the Middle Ages, you had, let's say, the division between in the church, then you had the Catholic Church and Orthodox, all these divisions, you know, the limits of Roman Empire, and then, of course, the Roman Empire was much earlier, but in terms of different legacies, it was always a point that where the limits of different entities touched. And this has somehow defined much of the identity of Bosnia. But as you know, after the Middle Ages, the different empires formed, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire that expanded through Europe. We had this specificity that while many other Middle-aged kingdoms or entities disappeared, somehow Bosnia was preserved as an administrative division of the Ottoman Empire. And you had the, you know, a situation of many people converting to Islam, and somehow at the same time, the tolerance in a Muslim land of the existence of Christians. So we had, when we get to the 19th century and the empires begin crumbling in Europe. So the Ottoman Empire is being expelled from Europe. Austrian Empire is also in crisis, and then it disappears with the First World War. You still have this you know, this territory called Bosnia that continues to exist with its own its own specific political identity. And then throughout the 19th century and then early 20th century, we have the replacement of multinational units as empires with the ideal of the nation state. But somehow, because what happened in that region was the creation of another multinational state, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, Bosnia continues to exist in this as a multinational, multi-ethnic territory. So we have after the First World War, the creation of the state of Yugoslavia. It was called at the time the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenians, but it was essentially a state that was the expansion of the Kingdom of Serbia that had already been created in the 19th century. So this state, as many other experiments in the interwar period, had its own fragilities, but essentially the issue of national question was always a big problem, especially the division of power between Serbs and Croats, and at the same time, the divisions between different political factions among, let's say, intra-Serb divisions. So we know that with the Second World War, this state, this Kingdom of Yugoslavia, is destroyed, and we have the partisan movement in Yugoslavia, and we have also fighting the German and Italian occupation. At the same time, we have also a civil war, raging with different sides. We had Croatian fascist collaborationists. You had also a collaborationist regime in Belgrade. You had a resistance that was supposedly monarchic but collaborationist with the fascist forces. So you had, a serious, at the same time, a civil war and a war of liberation raging in this territory. And most of the fighting and most of this war was raged in Bosnia proper. So in the territory that is Bosnia. And throughout these years of partisan struggle, and of course the communists were already very well organized before the Second World War. They had already put a lot of thought in terms of what is, the issue of, the problem of nationalities. And they came up with a solution for the new state as a federal solution. So creating a federation in which each republic would correspond more or less to the historical nation. So Croatia was defined as the historical Croatia, Serbia as on the basis of the 19th century state of Serbia. Then was created, Montenegro was restored, that existed in the interwar, that had existed before the end of the First World War, and was created also Macedonia. But in the case of Bosnia, there was a situation which was that there were three peoples, three a plurality of three ethnic groups, and then a multitude of smaller ethnic groups or small minorities that existed there. And the decision was that Bosnia should be, let's say, the homeland of those three peoples. So Serbs, Croats, and Muslims at the time, they were called Muslims. So the Bosnian Muslims were considered eventually as not only as a religious group, but as an ethnic group, as a national group. And so throughout Yugoslavia, what you had was a balance, a balance of power that in which, some of the power rested in the center, some of the power rested with the republics, but effectively it was a one-party system. It was, it was a communist party system, and ultimately, effectively, the power really rested on Tito, or the main figure of the regime, the President Tito, who lived until 1980, until he was well into his 80s, and he was like always the ultimate arbiter of all different interests and different conflicts that existed throughout these years. So this Yugoslav experiment was for a long time quite successful. It brought peace, it allowed for reconstruction, it allowed for a normal life and good standards of living. But by the time Tito dies, already the system was in crisis, especially because of the problem of the economic model, of external debt. And then you had throughout the 80s, everywhere you had the issue of inflation, standards of living going down, discontent, but here in this case also like uncertainty, great uncertainty about how to sustain this federation and how, now that the big patriarchal figure was gone, how to sustain this regime. So there was all this great uncertainty, and somehow, throughout this period, of course, we have also in the 80s, everything that is going on with the Soviet Union, with what we were calling the Eastern Bloc, but somehow the Yugoslav case is a bit separate from that, But throughout all this time of uncertainty, one of the pillars of Yugoslav regime was this idea of the partisan struggle, this principle that was the principle of brotherhood and unity, so that different ethnic groups, different nationalities, different republics could coexist and retain their own identities whilst at the same time building something in common. And with time, this ideal started also losing a lot of its appeal, and somehow the discontentment that was beginning to grow found expression, first of all, in Serbia. And this was due, especially, the main factor that created this discontent was the situation in Kosovo. So Kosovo was a separate entity within the Republic of Serbia, but so Serbia had, so Yugoslavia had 6 republics, but Serbia had 2 autonomous units within that republic that were also federal units. So they also had a seat in the federation. And, it is in this, there are, especially the Serbian Orthodox Church starts making a lot of complaints that the interests of the Serb people in Kosovo are not being respected, that there is an exodus, that Serbs are being persecuted in Kosovo. So it creates a situation that plays very much with racism. So Albanians and also the Roma in the context of Yugoslavia there was a hierarchy of like the good peoples and they were in the bottom. So all this racism is then creates an opportunity for populism and creates an opportunity for a new generation of politicians that needed to emerge anyway, because the generation of, let's say, the partisan struggle, they were all getting old. And so in the 80s, this is how Slobodan Milosevic emerges, within the Republic of Serbia. He was, a gray apparatchik, he was a banker, he was a person that had never been, seen as particularly interesting, but he manages to explore this discontent about Kosovo and emerge within the Communist Party in Serbia. And by 1989, not only he is the president of Serbia, but he manages to control much of the media, so the federal media and the media in the Republic of Serbia, and he manages to place his own people in three other units. So he manages to control Montenegro and to control also the Communist Party in Vojvodina, the northern autonomous region, and Kosovo. So by 1989, while the Berlin Wall is about to crumble, how long will the Soviet Union last? All this uncertainty, and in Serbia in Yugoslavia there is a strong man emerging that for a while maybe he could become the new Tito, and this is a person that speaks at the same time the language of nationalism and the language of socialism, if we can call that socialism. That's a different question. But so, and obviously at the moment that you have, a particular faction controlling 4 different republics, you have a struggle at republic level because other republics were not comfortable with that. So this leads to the crumbling of, to the end of communist rule, because the federal communist party crumbles. Slovenia and Croatia leave the federal communist party, the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, and then their leaderships call for multi-party elections in each of these republics. So this is how multi-party system is introduced, not in the federation as a whole, but each of the republics moves into a multi-party system. It's so difficult to explain these things, and 15 minutes have passed. The point is, once Yugoslavia is crumbling because the party that gave unity to that territory no longer exists, we have a situation in Bosnia that Bosnia reluctantly is forced, first of all, to multi-party elections. And in these multi-party elections, what emerges is like, on a censitary vote, the 3 major ethnic groups get practically the same proportions of votes as they have as the size of their ethnic group. And they, so this in 1990, 1991, these 3 parties are supposed to be on a coalition, supposed to, what matters is to, they say, strušiti communism. So like, to dismantle communism, the 3 parties are united in dismantling communism. So it's almost like people are like sleepwalking to war. But obviously they are not sleepwalking to war, because war entails a lot of preparation, so you cannot sleepwalk into war. So at the same time that you have this very naive ideal that you can have Bosnia ruled by a coalition of 3 nationalist parties, you have at the same time movements towards, first of all, you have a war in Croatia. So Croatia wants to become independent, and, there is a rebellion in areas of Serb majority against that. And you have an intervention from the federal army in Croatia, first of all, in the name of Yugoslavia. And then when you have in Croatia a ceasefire in the end of 91, all the weapons that were stationed in Croatia are moved to Bosnia. And all the army, the Yugoslav army that is stationed now in Bosnia, which is the bulk of the Yugoslav army, becomes staffed mostly with Bosnian Serbs. So there is an ethnic cleansing of the Yugoslav army before you have the ethnic cleansing on the ground. And so, with the Yugoslav army in place, controlling practically, much of the territory and key points, etc., you have then a conflict between the 3 political parties that prior were supposed to be in coalition. And there's a whole escalation, and a colleague of mine that did research on this, he calls it an ethnicized conflict. So that the conflict was not ethnic because there wasn't previously, a conflict, life was not conflictual in Bosnia at that time, but that those political parties created the conflict and ethnicized it. The conflict between like, what should happen to Bosnia? Should Bosnia become part of a 3rd Yugoslavia led by Serbia, or should Bosnia become an independent state? And here, I will have to finish at the beginning of the war, but I think you guys more or less are aware of what happened during the war. But the point here is that, so we have a situation that Yugoslavia itself is crumbling, Slovenia and Croatia become independent, and there's the question of what happens to the rest, to the other federal units. So this is a question of international law, and there was an international law commission called the Badinter Commission that studied the case and decided that Yugoslavia was in the process of dissolution. So Yugoslavia effectively no longer existed. And with international law, if the federal state doesn't exist, then the federal units have a statehood of their own. But in the case of Bosnia, because of the specificities of this, multi-ethnicity, the same commission recommends that so that Bosnia becomes recognized as an independent state, it should have a referendum. So a referendum is organized that is 60% in favor of independence, but I mean, actually, it's much more than 60%, but the point is that Serb population boycotts the referendum. If the Serb population had voted in mass against, it would be somehow like 60%. But the point is that this referendum is followed immediately by a war. So the referendum happens in February, March, and the war starts in April. And the war is waged on the idea initially, so like the Serb forces in Bosnia claim that they do not want to leave Yugoslavia. But at the same time, they are building a national state, a national Serb state in Bosnia, and working towards the destruction of Bosnia. They call it even like the former Bosnia, so that they are working towards the partition of Bosnia, and that Bosnia by the end of the war was not supposed to exist. So somehow, because of inaction of the international community, the war raged for 4 years. So the non-Serbs, especially the Muslims, they were left almost defenseless. So they had to wage a war of resistance against alienation. You had genocide taking place, and we could discuss whether genocide was only 95 in Srebrenica, or if the first assault was also genocidal. But what happened is that in the end of the war, there was a division de facto of the country. There was, forced movement of the population in which half of the population actually moved. And we had 100,000 deaths, and of which, a big proportion of civilians, and wide destruction, but we did not have the partition. So we are in this situation, as the case of Lebanon, as the case of Cyprus, of countries that went through serious turmoil, but somehow the war ended. But turmoil, I mean, some of the issues that led to the war are still present, and these societies are very unstable and extremely fragile. So this is the situation where we are now. I will now pass to Martin, and I'm sure that in questions and answers, I will be able to fill up much more. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm just going to talk a little about what the left, well, particularly the British left, said about the Bosnian war. Firstly, what we said that it's a long-standing principle of socialism to support the right of nations to self-determination and to support oppressed, weaker nations against attempts at domination by stronger states. And so we said in the case of Bosnia, this meant siding with Bosnia, the Bosnian government forces, against the alliance of the Serbian state, the Yugoslav Federal Army, which had been, as Sarah describes, transformed into a Serbian army, and the militias, the Bosnian Serb militias, which were armed and promoted by the Serbian state. Taking that position didn't mean that we ignored the complications of Bosnia. Sarah says, here you have a country, a unit which has been a unit for hundreds of years, and which has, in fact, has been welded more into a distinct unit by the recent experience of the partisan war, which was conducted, as Sarah says, both against the Nazis and the Italians, but also, for example, against the Croat Ustashi state, which claimed that Bosnia was simply part of Croatia. This was a Croat state. That was a struggle waged on the basis of, on the promise of reconstructing Bosnia as a homeland for its distinct peoples, one homeland. So it's a complication, and we said, I think, what needed to be said about the drift of the Bosnian government towards a Muslim communalist policies, as distinct from unifying Bosnian policies, but that was a qualification within the framework of siding with Bosnia against what we described as Serbian imperialism, and, for example, opposing the arms embargo which was applied to the Bosnian government, which was of some consequence because Milosevic had control of the assets, the armories of the old federal Yugoslav army, and Bosnia is landlocked. You know, there wasn't an easy route for arms to get in. We sustained that position by looking at the fact that the Milosevic had not just intervened in Bosnia, he'd waged a war to stop Croatia being independent. He'd even tried to wage a war which didn't last very long, to try to stop Slovenia being independent, although Slovenia had no real Serb minority. And we also noted that in the war there were atrocities on both sides, but simply there were a great many more atrocities carried out by the Serb chauvinists. For example, there was a systematic destruction of mosques, for example, in where they existed in what was claimed as Serb territory, whereas in the main in cities like Tuzla and Sarajevo, the city authorities were at pains to repair damage, for example, to the Orthodox churches. So that's the position we took. Now, there were some on the left then, this is a grouping which doesn't exist now, who sided with Bosnia like us, but essentially without making any criticisms of the Muslim communalist drift of the Bosnian government. It was a group known by the name of its paper, the Workers' Press, which came out of the old Workers' Revolutionary Party, which is unknown now, but for a long time was the biggest group on the revolutionary or claiming to be revolutionary left in Britain. And it had broken up in 1985. This was the biggest remnant, and this became their campaign. And as we said, they did a lot of brave and useful practical work. They organised convoys to go to Bosnia, aid to Bosnia, but they did that without political criticism. I was looking back on an article I wrote at the time, and the way it sums it up is that if you try to find out what was happening in Bosnia from the left press, you'd have to conclude there were three completely different countries being talked about. There was the country we talked about, three different conflicts. There was the one we talked about. There was the one Workers' Press talked about, and their point of reference always was the Spanish Civil War. They said this was a rerunning of the same issues as the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. And there was a third one in which what this appeared was you had a Serbian government which was trying to defend what people like Tony Benn, for example, considered to be the socialist heritage of former Yugoslavia. And they were defending that essentially against the machinations of what they called imperialism. And for them, imperialism was nothing to do with the attempts of the Serbian state to control the weaker nationalities of Yugoslavia. It was about the powers of the European Union and the USA. So basically, their position was the Croatian independence movement, the Slovenian independence movement, and the Bosnian independence movement were all artifacts of the European Union, or some powers in the European Union, particularly Germany and the USA. What we thought was wrong with that was we didn't think that the old Yugoslavia was socialist, that we didn't think it contained any more progressive socialist principles, certainly not under Milosevic as against the Bosnian regime, that the peoples of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia had the right to self-determination and therefore, to get allies where they could. And in any case, the presentation of the position of the big Western powers was inaccurate. For example, they were imposing an arms embargo on Bosnia. They weren't. In the end, NATO did bomb some Serbian positions in 1995, which was the final push which led to the Dayton Agreement. But generally, the position of the Western powers had been that they wanted to limit the fragmentation of Yugoslavia to the minimum. And essentially their advice to the people of Bosnia, and even more to the people of Kosovo, is well, what Milosevic is doing is, we agree it's not very good, but you should bite your lips and put up with it and just try to mitigate it. There's one other position which in a way might be quite surprising. Well, it was quite surprising at the time, which was the position of socialist worker.
Now, you've had 10 minutes, Martin.
Okay, give me another couple of minutes.
Sure.
Yeah, so the sort of anti-imperialism I've talked about, where imperialism isn't conceived of as one state trying to control another, but it's just something which is inherent in certain governments, particularly the US, wasn't something new. That had been the position of the communist parties for decades. So what the principle, the old socialist principle of support for oppressed nations, support for national liberation struggles, have been transmuted into a negative principle of opposition to imperialism. Imperialism identified solely with the USA and its allies, so it didn't apply, for example, to Poland. Poland could be as oppressed as it liked, but still Polish nationalists who objected to Russian domination would be reactionaries and not to be supported. Now, Socialist Worker didn't have that view. Socialist Worker had been in favour of the national rights of the peoples of Eastern Europe against Russian domination. So you would think that it would apply the same principle here, but in fact it didn't. It didn't take the same position as Tony Benn and other people who were close to the wavelength of the old communist parties. But what it said is this is simply a war in which there is nothing to be said except that it's terrible on all sides. They said this is just a conflict between different ruling groups for territories. Now, I suppose every war is a conflict between different ruling groups for territories, but the difference here was there was no attempt by the Bosnian government to conquer bits of Serbia. There wasn't. But there was an attempt by Serbia to break up and dominate Bosnia. They took the same position on Croatia. I think the war in Slovenia passed without them having to make any comments, so they could just accept the independence of Slovenia as a fact. But throughout the war in Croatia, which was a long and very bloody war, they had the same position that this is just a conflict between different ruling groups, and we have no part in it. All we can do is deplore the war and wait for it to end. There's what this came from, I think, is a shift the SWP had made, the Socialist Worker had made a few years earlier in 1987. In 1987, near the end of the Iran-Iraq war, they suddenly shifted their position on that. They had, like us and like many on the left up until then, a position there of saying that, which we thought was correct for that war, to say this is a war where there is no good side to support. They switched to supporting Iran on the grounds that they said that the USA is supporting Iraq. Now, in fact, the USA had been supporting Iraq under the counter for some years before that, but they registered that. And so support for Iran was read off as Iran was the more anti-American power here. That's where it came from. Where it went on to was a position on the war in Kosovo in 1999, which went a bit further, which was effectively a position of support for Milosevic, with criticisms and so on, but it was a pro-Milosevic position. There's one last thing, if I can have 1 more minute.
You'll have to be, please.
Yes, okay.
We've got running out of time for questions.
Yes, okay. One more thing that needs to be commented on, which is important for discussions on the left since, is that one of the big arguments used by many on the left to justify supporting Serbia or not taking sides was that the Bosnian government were Islamic fundamentalists. And this was at least it was a struggle for secularism against the Islamic fundamentalism. Now, you would think that the Socialist Worker would be very receptive to this argument, because for some time now, Socialist Worker has made a big thing of saying, that they are the best fighters for Muslims, that of encouraging people to wear hijabs on protests because the hijab is an expression of solidarity with the oppressed and so on. Not at all, and you should just note that was not at all their position at the time. For example, you can read this. One of the points they're very emphatic is they said, look, the Muslims in community in Bosnia isn't and hasn't been oppressed. Now, that certainly isn't true in terms of the SWP's current position, because, for example, the hijab had been illegal from 1950 to 1992. It was banned by the Titoites. It was banned by them not, I think, as an anti-Muslim measure, as a secularist measure, which was, as far as I can make it, was in fact largely successful, despite the, there's been a religious revival since '92. But
Martin, you've had 3 extra minutes then.
Okay, anyway, that was for the socialist working time. That was not a factor. That was not something to be mentioned. Nor was it to be a fact to be mentioned that whatever had taken place before 1992, the war was in and of itself an oppression of the Bosnia as a nation and of the Muslim community within Bosnia.